July 27, 1962. Marilyn Monroe checked into the Cal-Neva Lodge on the California-Nevada border for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. She checked out on July 29, 48 hours later, but what happened during those 2 days has never been explained. The security cameras that covered every inch of Frank Sinatra's luxury resort mysteriously malfunctioned that entire weekend. The guest logs that should have recorded who visited Marilyn's cabin were destroyed. The hotel staff who saw her during those 48 hours were told to sign non-disclosure agreements that lasted until their deaths. And when Marilyn left Cal-Neva on that Sunday afternoon, witnesses said she looked like someone who had seen hell. This wasn't just a lost weekend. This was 48 hours that the most powerful men in America, from Hollywood to the Mafia to the White House, spent 6 decades trying to erase from history. Because what happened at Cal-Neva Lodge in late July 1962, just 9 days before Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom, involved secrets that could have destroyed Frank Sinatra's career, exposed the Kennedy family's darkest dealings, and revealed the true nature of organized crime's grip on Hollywood. And the only person who knew the full truth died 2 weeks later with a bottle of pills in her hand. But the 48 hours weren't completely erased. Fragments remain. Staff members who broke their silence decades later. FBI surveillance reports that documented who was at Cal-Neva that weekend. And most damning of all, a phone call Marilyn made on July 29, just hours after leaving the resort, where she told her psychiatrist 3 words that he never forgot: "They hurt me." If you want to discover the dark secrets behind Hollywood's golden age, the stories they tried to bury forever, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the truth that powerful people spent decades hiding. To understand what happened to Marilyn Monroe during that lost weekend, you first need to understand what Cal-Neva Lodge really was. Nestled on the shore of Lake Tahoe, straddling the state line between California and Nevada, it offered guests pristine mountain views, world-class entertainment, a full casino, and the kind of privacy that celebrities craved. But Cal-Neva was never just a resort. By 1960, when Frank Sinatra purchased a significant ownership stake in the property, Cal-Neva had become something far more dangerous, a neutral meeting ground where Hollywood glamour and organized crime could mix freely. The real owner, the man who controlled Cal-Neva's operations, was Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit and one of the most powerful mafia figures in America. Giancana couldn't own the property officially because of Nevada gaming regulations, so Sinatra served as the front man while Giancana ran things behind the scenes. This arrangement made Cal-Neva Lodge the perfect location for activities that needed to stay hidden. The resort's unique position on the state line meant California law enforcement had no jurisdiction over the Nevada side, and Nevada authorities were either paid off or intimidated. The guest list was carefully controlled, the staff were selected for loyalty, and the security systems could be conveniently disabled whenever someone powerful wanted privacy. By July 1962, Cal-Neva had become a hub for some of the darkest activities in organized crime. The FBI had the property under surveillance but couldn't legally enter without probable cause. They knew mob meetings were held there regularly. They knew politicians and judges came to be compromised, photographed in situations that would destroy their careers. And they knew Frank Sinatra was operating as a bridge between entertainment and organized crime. This was the place where Marilyn Monroe spent the last weekend of her functional life. This was where something happened to her, something so terrible that everyone involved spent 6 decades ensuring it would never become public. Marilyn arrived at Cal-Neva around 8:30 a.m. on Friday evening, driven from Los Angeles by a studio car service. Her publicist Pat Newcomb accompanied her, ostensibly to provide companionship, but also to serve as a buffer. At this point in late July 1962, Marilyn was barely holding herself together. She had been fired from Something's Got to Give 7 weeks earlier. The studio was suing her. Her career appeared to be over, and her consumption of barbiturates had reached dangerous levels. Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, had seen her that Friday morning before she left. His notes from that session, sealed until 2015, reveal he had serious reservations about Marilyn going to Cal-Neva. She was in a fragile psychological state, vulnerable to manipulation, desperate for validation. But Marilyn insisted on going, saying Frank Sinatra had personally invited her. What Greenson didn't know was that the invitation hadn't come solely from Sinatra. Sam Giancana wanted Marilyn at the resort that weekend, and when Sam Giancana wanted something, Frank Sinatra made it happen. The night manager, Edward Johnson, greeted Marilyn personally and escorted her to Cabin 52, a luxury accommodation about 100 yards from the main building. Pat Newcomb took one bedroom, Marilyn the other. They ordered room service, and according to Pat's later testimony, Marilyn seemed to relax slightly. She took her usual evening pills and talked about seeing Sinatra's show on Saturday night, but something changed late Friday night. Pat heard voices in Marilyn's bedroom around midnight. Male voices, multiple men. She tried to check on Marilyn, but found the door locked from inside. She knocked, called Marilyn's name, but got no response except muffled conversation and what sounded like crying. Pat stood outside that door for almost 20 minutes before she heard it unlock and saw two men leave. She didn't recognize them. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply walked out into the night. When Pat entered Marilyn's room, she found the actress sitting on the bed, fully dressed, staring at nothing. Marilyn wouldn't say who the men were or what they wanted. She just kept repeating, "They said I have to cooperate. They said I have to keep quiet." Pat tried to get more information, but Marilyn wouldn't elaborate. She took more pills and eventually fell into troubled sleep. Saturday morning started normally. Marilyn woke around 10 a.m. and seemed disoriented, but not dramatically worse than usual. She and Pat had breakfast, then spent a few hours by the pool. Other guests noticed Marilyn but said something seemed off. She wasn't engaging with people. She seemed nervous, constantly looking around, flinching when people approached. Around 2 p.m., everything changed. A housekeeper named Maria Flores went to Cabin 52 to deliver fresh towels. When Marilyn answered the door, Maria immediately noticed bruises on Marilyn's upper arms, dark marks that looked like fingerprints, like someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave impressions. Marilyn saw Maria staring and quickly pulled on a robe, but the housekeeper had already seen. Before Maria could say anything, a man appeared behind Marilyn in the doorway. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss. He looked at Maria with an expression that made her blood run cold and told her that her services were no longer required at Cabin 52. Maria left quickly, knowing she had witnessed something she was supposed to forget. Late Saturday night, Maria told night manager Edward Johnson what she had seen. The bruises, Giancana in the cabin, the fear in Marilyn's eyes. Johnson tried to check on Marilyn himself around 11 p.m., but two men blocked his path and told him Miss Monroe didn't need assistance. Johnson heard sounds coming from inside the cabin, raised voices, crying, what sounded like furniture breaking. He stood outside for almost an hour, debating whether to call police, but he knew what happened to people who interfered with Giancana's business, so he walked away. Around 3 a.m. Sunday morning, bartender Tommy Chen was called to deliver drinks to Cabin 52. What he saw shocked him so much that he broke his silence 20 years later. Marilyn looked like a zombie. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy, dilated. Her speech was slurred beyond intoxication, beyond heavy sedation. She could barely stand, leaning against the doorframe, and when she tried to take the drink tray, her hands shook so badly that bottles fell and shattered. Tommy tried to help her, but Marilyn pushed him away and whispered, "I'm not safe here. They're going to kill me. Tell someone. Please tell someone." Then Giancana appeared, and Tommy was dismissed, told to leave immediately and forget everything he'd seen. The guest list at Cal-Neva that weekend reads like a roster of American power and corruption. FBI surveillance reports declassified decades later confirm Sam Giancana was present throughout, ostensibly visiting his girlfriend, singer Phyllis McGuire. Frank Sinatra was also there, though witnesses said he seemed tense, unhappy. He stayed close to Giancana and visited Cabin 52 multiple times. But the most disturbing name on the guest list was Peter Lawford, Sinatra's friend and Rat Pack member, but more importantly, brother-in-law of President John F. Kennedy. By July 1962, Lawford had become the intermediary between Marilyn and the Kennedy brothers, the man who arranged their secret meetings, the man responsible for managing Marilyn when she became inconvenient. Phone records show calls were placed from the cabin to a Washington, D.C. number associated with Robert Kennedy. Several staff members reported seeing Lawford in intense, angry conversations with Marilyn. The theory among researchers is that Marilyn was brought to Cal-Neva under false pretenses. By late July 1962, she had become a problem for the Kennedy administration. She had affairs with both Kennedy brothers. She knew details about their private lives, their political dealings, potentially sensitive government information, and she was threatening to go public. Marilyn had hinted in interviews that she had explosive information. She told friends she kept a diary of her relationships. She suggested she felt used by the Kennedys and was considering revenge. For the Kennedy administration, with Bobby Kennedy prosecuting organized crime figures, including Giancana, Marilyn represented an existential threat. The Cal-Neva weekend was an attempt to control Marilyn, to intimidate her into silence. Giancana had reasons to want her quiet, given his complicated Kennedy relationship. Lawford represented Kennedy family interests, and Sinatra, caught between mob connections and political ambitions, hosted the whole affair. What happened in Cabin 52 was a coordinated effort by powerful men to break Marilyn's will, to terrify her into compliance, to make her understand the consequences of talking. Whether it went beyond intimidation, whether she was assaulted or forcibly drugged, remains unclear because everyone refused to talk and evidence was destroyed. Sunday afternoon, Marilyn left Cal-Neva and returned to Los Angeles. Multiple witnesses described her condition, and their accounts are consistent and disturbing. She could barely walk without assistance. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused. She didn't respond when people spoke. She moved like someone in a trance. Phyllis McGuire later told friends that seeing Marilyn leave was one of the most disturbing things she'd witnessed. She described Marilyn as catatonic, like someone had reached inside her and turned off a switch. Pat Newcomb refused to speak about the weekend, telling friends only that something horrible had occurred. The driver who took them back to Los Angeles, Rudy Kotsky, gave a statement describing Marilyn's condition. She didn't speak for 3 hours. She sat staring out the window, occasionally crying silently. About halfway through the drive, she suddenly spoke, "I'm not safe anymore. They hurt me. They said if I talk, they'll hurt me worse. They said they can make me disappear and no one will care." Pat tried to comfort her, but Marilyn shook her head. "You don't understand. They own everything. They own the police. They own the newspapers. They own Hollywood. If they want me dead, I'm dead." When Marilyn arrived home, her housekeeper Eunice Murray was shocked by her condition. Marilyn looked like someone who had aged 10 years in a weekend. Her skin was gray. Her hands shook constantly. She went immediately to her bedroom, took a heavy dose of sleeping pills, and collapsed. Over the next hours, Marilyn made several phone calls. One to Dr. Greenson, where she said they hurt me, and refused to elaborate. Another to Joe DiMaggio, who later told friends Marilyn sounded terrified, kept saying she was in danger, that powerful men were threatening her. The most disturbing call was to friend Jean Carmen, where Marilyn kept repeating, "They said I have to die, they said I'm too dangerous." The men at the lake, Frank's friends, the men who own everything. Within days of Marilyn's departure, the cover-up began. Security footage was destroyed, with management claiming technical malfunction. Guest logs disappeared. Every staff member who witnessed anything was presented with non-disclosure agreements by attorneys representing Sinatra. The agreements were comprehensive and threatening, making clear that discussion would result in legal action and potentially worse consequences. But the cover-up went beyond silencing employees. FBI files revealed J. Edgar Hoover was aware of what happened at Cal-Neva, yet instead of investigating, he buried it. Why? Because information was power, and holding explosive secrets about powerful men was more valuable than exposing them. The FBI had Cal-Neva under surveillance that weekend. Their reports, heavily redacted even when declassified, reference Subject being present and her status deteriorating significantly. But the details remain classified even today, 60 years later. This suggests what happened involved matters of national security, connections to the highest government levels, information so sensitive it cannot be released. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5, 1962, just 9 days after leaving Cal-Neva. The official verdict was probable suicide by barbiturate overdose, though evidence has been disputed for 6 decades. Whether Marilyn took those pills herself or whether they were administered by someone else may never be known. But what is clear is that whatever happened at Cal-Neva broke something fundamental inside her. Dr. Greenson's notes from their final sessions describe Marilyn in extreme paranoia after returning from Lake Tahoe. She believed she was being watched. She believed her phone was tapped. She believed powerful men were planning to kill her. Greenson tried to convince her these were paranoid delusions. But what if Marilyn was accurately assessing the danger she was in? In the days after Marilyn's death, Peter Lawford was seen at her house, supposedly cleaning up sensitive materials. Sinatra, when informed of her death, reportedly said, "I knew this would happen." Giancana disappeared from public view for weeks. The LAPD investigation was cursory at best. Evidence was removed before investigators could document it. Phone records disappeared. The timeline contains gaps never adequately explained, but perhaps the most telling evidence connecting her death to Cal-Neva is what happened to the resort. Less than a year later, Giancana's secret ownership was exposed. Sinatra lost his gaming license and was forced to sell. The resort was shut down, not because of illegal activities, but because Marilyn's death had drawn too much attention. It's as if the men who controlled Cal-Neva decided it had become too dangerous, too exposed, so they shut it down, destroyed evidence, paid off witnesses, and moved on. The place where Marilyn spent her final functional weekend was erased from history as completely as possible. For over 30 years, what happened at Cal-Neva remained one of Hollywood's most closely guarded secrets. But as decades passed and principles died, the wall of silence cracked. Edward Johnson broke his silence in 1999, describing what he witnessed: the bruises, the sounds of violence, Giancana's control, the intimidation. He said he lived with guilt for 37 years. Tommy Chen gave a similar interview in 2001, describing Marilyn's zombie-like condition and her desperate whisper, "They're going to kill me." Maria Flores spoke to investigators in 2003, confirming Johnson's account and adding details about the atmosphere of fear that pervaded the resort. As witnesses came forward, a picture emerged. Marilyn was lured to Cal-Neva under false pretenses. Once there, she was confronted by Kennedy family representatives and Giancana's associates. She was told to stay quiet about her Kennedy relationships, about information she possessed that could damage powerful people. When Marilyn refused to be intimidated, the confrontation escalated. She was physically restrained, leaving bruises. She was forcibly drugged, leaving her zombie-like. She was threatened explicitly that if she talked, she would be killed and it would look like suicide. She was psychologically broken, subjected to hours of intimidation and abuse. Whether they intended to kill her or simply terrify her is unclear. What is clear is that they destroyed her. They took a vulnerable woman already at the breaking point and pushed her over the edge. 9 days later, she was dead, and whether she took those pills in despair or they were given to her, the men who broke her at Cal-Neva were responsible. 60 years later, no one has been held accountable. Giancana was murdered in 1975 before testifying about CIA connections to organized crime. Sinatra died in 1998, never having spoken about that weekend. Lawford died in 1984. The Kennedy brothers were assassinated before investigations into their Marilyn relationships could be completed. The crime went unpunished because the men who committed it were too powerful to prosecute. They controlled evidence, they intimidated witnesses, they had connections at the highest levels, and they understood that in America in 1962 you could destroy a vulnerable woman and get away with it. Cal-Neva Lodge still stands, though Cabin 52 was torn down years ago. The staff members who witnessed Marilyn's destruction are all dead, their testimonies preserved only in interviews given decades later. But the story remains, connecting Hollywood glamour, organized crime, and political power in the exploitation and destruction of a vulnerable woman. It's about how the most powerful men in America coordinated to silence someone who threatened them and got away with it because the victim was just Marilyn Monroe, just a troubled actress nobody would believe. The 48 hours at Cal-Neva weren't just a lost weekend. They were the final act of a tragedy unfolding for years, when all the forces that exploited Marilyn came together to finish what they started. And 9 days later, when she died alone, surrounded by pill bottles, the men who broke her at Cal-Neva got exactly what they wanted: permanent silence. Even after 6 decades, Fundamental questions remain unanswered. What exactly was said during confrontations? What specific threats were made? What physical abuse occurred? And was the decision to eliminate Marilyn made at Cal-Neva, or did those hours simply break her to where death became inevitable? FBI files remain heavily redacted. Entire pages are blacked out, names removed, details classified. This suggests what happened involved more than intimidation by gangsters. It suggests connections to the highest government levels, to national security concerns, to secrets still considered too sensitive to reveal, and that may be the most disturbing element. The truth is still being actively suppressed 60 years later, decades after everyone involved has died. What could justify that secrecy? What information could still be so sensitive? The answer is that Cal-Neva represents a moment when organized crime, Hollywood power, and the highest government levels came together to silence a woman who knew too much. It represents a crime committed by men celebrated as heroes and icons, and it represents a truth about America that challenges our comfortable narratives. Marilyn went to Cal-Neva on July 27, 1962, looking for rest. She left July 29 as a broken woman who would be dead 9 days later. What happened was witnessed by dozens, documented by FBI surveillance, and covered up by the most powerful men in America. And the fact that files remain classified and questions unanswered is perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Because the truth about Cal-Neva isn't just about what happened to Marilyn during one terrible weekend. It's about a system that allowed powerful men to abuse, exploit, intimidate, and ultimately destroy a vulnerable woman, then cover up their crimes so thoroughly that justice was never possible. That's the legacy of Cal-Neva. Not just Marilyn's destruction, but proof that her destroyers were right when they told her they owned everything. They were right. They did own everything, and they got away with it. 60 years later, we're still living with consequences of that reality. Still fighting systems that protect the powerful at expense of the vulnerable, still trying to uncover truths buried by men who believed they were above the law, and still asking the question Marilyn asked after leaving Cal-Neva: who will believe me? Who will protect me? Who will care? The answer she received was no one, and 9 days later, she was dead. The 48 hours remain one of the darkest chapters in American history, a story of power, corruption, exploitation, and murder covered up so successfully that most people don't even know it happened. But the truth is there, in witness testimonies, in FBI files, in the pattern of events from that weekend to her death 9 days later. What happened at Cal-Neva wasn't just tragedy, it was crime. A crime committed by men who thought they were untouchable, and the most disturbing part is they were right. They were untouchable. They faced no consequences. And Marilyn, who went to Lake Tahoe for a relaxing weekend and came back broken and terrified, paid with her life for knowing too much. That's the real story of the lost weekend. Not just 48 hours that disappeared from history, but 48 hours that revealed the darkest truth about power in America, that if you have enough of it, you can do anything to anyone, and the system will protect you rather than your victim. Marilyn learned that truth in Cabin 52. She learned it from Sinatra, from Giancana, from Lawford, from all the powerful men who gathered to make sure she understood her powerlessness. And 9 days later, that truth killed her. The cameras that malfunctioned, the records destroyed, the witnesses silenced, the files still classified, all of it adds up to one conclusion. Marilyn's last weekend was spent being destroyed by men who had power to erase evidence, and 60 years later, they're still succeeding.